Before written history, someone carved vast rooms into Georgia's cliffs and raised sanctuaries in places that seem impossibly remote. Who were they? Why these landscapes, these river crossings, these high plateaus, these sheer faces of stone? And how many hidden layers still lie beneath the monuments that stand there now? Every carving, every collapsed wall, every buried foundation leaves a trace of a past still waiting to be understood. Vardzia Cave. In the sun-washed cliffs of southern Georgia, Vardzia emerges as a hollowed horizon of entrances and shadowed chambers, its tiered facade appearing almost accidental against the volcanic tuff, until the eye settles and begins to notice the deliberate rhythm of carved cells, terraces, and ascending corridors that thread the mountainside like the remnants of a forgotten hive. The first impression is one of quiet immensity, a sense that the landscape itself has been persuaded rather than forced into human shape. And as the viewer moves closer, the illusion of irregularity dissolves into the unmistakable order of a medieval monastic world pushed deep into rock. Archaeological surveys trace its largest expansion to the 12th century, a period when the Kingdom of Georgia consolidated its highland defences and monastic landscapes. Yet the earliest cavities hint at more ancient phases of hermitage, their original forms softened by centuries of wind, rainfall and seismic shifting that blur the boundaries of documented history. Inside, a labyrinth of tunnels opens in sudden pockets of light, where collapsed ceilings reveal the sky, and soot-darkened niches suggest long cycles of occupation interrupted by raids, earthquakes, and the slow erosion that continues to shave the cliff face. The echo of water, still guided by narrow engineered channels, reveals a complexity of planning often overshadowed by the monumental exterior. Subterranean cisterns, storage vaults, and interlinked stairways show a settlement designed not only for contemplation but for endurance, its builders exploiting the pliability of the volcanic stone to create a sheltered vertical town concealed within the bluff. Excavated pottery fragments, metalwork, and faint fresco remnants in the surviving church of the Dormition anchor the site to the flourishing cultural landscape of Queen Tamar's reign. Yet even these tangible artifacts raise questions when viewed against the sheer scale of excavation, for the tools and labour required to hollow hundreds of rooms into solid rock imply a community far larger and more organised than surviving records describe. The contradictions accumulate quietly. Access routes that appear older than the monastic complex itself, chambers whose functions remain uncertain, and cuttings that extend beyond mapped areas, as though a deeper, earlier core lies buried behind later expansions. Seismological studies of the region suggest cycles of tectonic disturbance that may have obscured or collapsed entire sections, while geological analyses of the tuff layers indicate that ancient artisans understood the difference between stable strata and brittle seams, selecting precise heights for corridors that later generations merely inherited. Some archaeologists propose that the earliest hermit cells could follow patterns similar to those found across the wider Caucasus, where isolated ascetic dwellings often predate formal monastic institutions by centuries. But definitive timelines remain elusive, obscured by centuries of repair and adaptation. As the mountain cools in late light, the carved galleries seem to withdraw into shadow, hinting at the volumes still sealed behind unexcavated thresholds or lost to natural decay, and the observer is left with the impression of a place only partly understood, a hybrid of spiritual retreat, strategic refuge, and geological artifact shaped by hands that left more stone than story. Vardzia endures as a carved monument, whose full chronology cannot be cleanly separated from the mountain that holds it, its rooms and passageways offering glimpses of intention without granting certainty. And as dusk gathers across the cliff, the vast structure appears less like a completed design and more like an ongoing conversation between human effort and an ever-shifting landscape, its earliest origins still resting somewhere beyond the reach of written history. Uplistsikhe, rock-cut city. Carved into a windswept promontory above the Mtskheta river, Uplistsikhe reveals itself gradually, beginning as a scatter of weather-rounded cavities, before resolving into a sprawling rock-cut settlement whose contours seem to hover between natural erosion and deliberate design, inviting the quiet recognition that its earliest phases may reach so far back into prehistory that even the categories used to describe it feel insufficient. Approached from the river plain, the city rises in soft, rippling terraces, each scored with entrances smoothed by centuries of sun and winter frost. And as steps and walkways begin to emerge from the lichen-dusted tuff, the settlement assumes the aspect of an open-air labyrinth, where temples, halls and utilitarian chambers are arranged across a surface shaped as much by uplifted geology as by human intention. Archaeological excavations identify layers of occupation stretching from the early Iron Age through the High Medieval period. Yet the deeper one looks, the more ambiguous the boundaries become. Shrines whose earliest forms may carry echoes of Bronze Age ritual landscapes, storage pits cut into bedrock that lack secure dating, and drainage channels whose simplicity complicates attempts to assign them to any single cultural horizon. The so-called Street of the Prince, a sloping central artery carved directly into stone, threads past ceremonial platforms and vaulted halls whose ceilings still display the distinctive ripple patterns left by ancient chisels, the marks preserved like signatures of vanished craftsmen. Nearby, open courtyards suggest communal gatherings, while adjacent chambers narrow into passageways where sunlight rarely penetrates, leaving the impression of a place that grew incrementally, one adapted cavity at a time, rather than a single master plan imposed at once. Geological surveys of the outcrop reveal a complex stratification of volcanic deposits that fracture in predictable ways, and it becomes evident that the earliest builders possessed a practical understanding of which layers could bear weight and which could be hollowed without collapse, a craft that would have been learned not from texts but from patient observation over generations. Yet the very durability of this rock-cut environment obscures its chronological seams. Medieval modifications blur into older foundations. Collapsed ceilings mimic natural weathering, and ceremonial niches cluster in patterns that might indicate shifting religious practices, but cannot be assigned with confidence to any specific era. The blend of pagan and later Christian features, such as the 9th to 10th century basilica perched atop the complex, adds another layer of interpretive difficulty, for it suggests a continuity of sacred use even as political landscapes changed around it, with each cultural phase adapting inherited spaces rather than replacing them. Pottery sherds and metal fragments recovered from various terraces help anchor certain periods of activity, but enormous sections remain undated, particularly in the lower eastern districts where erosion has softened architectural lines into ambiguity. Here, semicircular chambers open onto the river like eroded shells, hinting at functions that could range from habitation to storage to ritual, without offering decisive clues. Some researchers note parallels between Uplistsikhe's oldest forms and other early Caucasian rock shelters that predate complex urbanization, proposing that the site may have originated as a cluster of seasonal or semi-permanent dwellings, long before it evolved into a centre of regional importance, yet the lack of organic material preserved in such exposed conditions limits precision. Contradictions accumulate slowly, staircases that lead to apparent dead ends until shifting light reveals worn ledges, wine presses cut into stone, whose simplicity makes them difficult to situate chronologically, and water channels that continue to function after millennia, though no surviving records explain how their maintenance was organised. Even the city's defensive aspects ramparts, lookout points, and controlled access routes raise questions about how much of its fortification belongs to documented history and how much to earlier, unrecorded adaptations to a landscape that has always demanded vigilance. As the afternoon sun travels across the plateau, the recessed chambers brighten and then darken in sequence, exposing the fluidity of their forms, and it becomes clear that Uplistsikhe is less a frozen ruin than an evolving palimpsest in stone, each generation carving, enlarging or abandoning spaces according to needs now only faintly discernible. The site reveals a settlement whose identity cannot be reduced to a single epoch. Part sanctuary, part fortress, part urban experiment, shaped repeatedly over more than a millennium, its earliest intentions obscured by the very permanence that preserved it. When dusk settles along the river, and the wind rises through the hollowed corridors, the city seems to fold back into the landscape, leaving behind the impression of an ancient centre that exists on the threshold between memory and geology. Its origins grounded in evidence, yet still receding just beyond the reach of recorded history. David Gareja Cave Complex. Southward along Georgia's semi-arid frontier, where rolling steppe meets broken ridges of sedimentary rock, the David Gareja Cave Complex emerges as a constellation of monasteries dispersed across a weathered landscape, its honeycomb of chambers stretched along cliff faces that catch the shifting light in muted tones of gold and ash. At first sight, the setting appears austere, almost emptied of human presence, with low shrubs trembling in the wind and long slopes carved by centuries of runoff. Yet from within this sparseness, the entrances to Lavra, Udabno, Dodo's Arka, and other monastic clusters reveal deliberate shaping of the earth, each cavity enlarged from natural hollows or cut entirely by hand to form chapels, refectories, sleeping quarters, and meditative cells whose quiet perseveres despite the centuries that have passed. Archaeological and historical studies trace the foundation of the complex to the 6th century, when ascetic traditions spread across the Caucasus. But the terrain's deeper human footprint is more elusive. Scattered tools, faint hearth traces, and eroded paths suggest earlier pastoral or hermitic activity, their timelines blurred by erosion and the difficulty of preserving organic material in such exposed highlands. Inside the caves, fragments of frescoes, some vibrant, others ghosted to near invisibility, testify to cycles of artistic flourish, theological debate, and cultural exchange that once animated these remote halls. Pigments layered atop older compositions hint at periods of renewal and reoccupation, while unfinished scenes suggest interruptions caused by shifting political conditions or incursions that left parts of the complex abandoned. Geological surveys reveal that the soft sandstone and siltstone of the region split along predictable bedding planes, explaining both the ease with which ancient monks carved their chambers and the vulnerability that has led to collapses, slumping ceilings, and the gradual fading of architectural details. Such conditions complicate efforts to reconstruct earlier phases, for the rock itself erases traces with each season's freeze-thaw cycle. Among the more puzzling features are sharply angled drainage channels that thread between clusters of cells, their precision suggesting coordinated planning across different monastic groups, though the absence of detailed records leaves open whether these systems were devised in a single organised effort or accumulated through generations of practical improvisation. Likewise, some chambers contain niches whose purposes remain contested, possibly storage, possibly devotional, while others open onto ledges that overlook the steppe, vantage points that may have served as lookouts, or simply places of contemplation. Contradictions emerge in the interweaving of ascetic isolation with signs of communal infrastructure. Wine presses carved into bedrock, water cisterns engineered to collect scarce rainfall, and paths worn deep by repeated passage, all of which point to sustained habitation, even as the remote location suggests a retreat from worldly concerns. Historical accounts detail episodes of destruction, most notably during invasions in the 13th and 17th centuries, yet the material evidence shows not only loss, but adaptation, with later occupants reshaping chambers, adding annexes, or sealing entrances to create more defensible positions. In some sectors, blackened ceilings bear witness to prolonged use of open flames, while the minimal soot in others implies different functions or shorter cycles of occupation. Such variations hint at an internal hierarchy or diversification of roles within the monastic communities, though the specifics remain uncertain. As sunlight fades across the ridge and the wind settles into the carved recesses, the complex appears to oscillate between exposure and concealment, its open facades facing the steppe, while its inner passages retreat into shadow. Standing before these worn but enduring structures, one senses a layered history anchored by monastic tradition, yet textured by older, less documented activity, a sequence of adaptations shaped as much by the land as by the beliefs of those who sought solitude here. The David Gareja complex thus remains a landscape of devotion and endurance, where evidence and absence coexist in equal measure, and where the earliest human choices, half preserved, half erased by time, continue to leave quiet traces along the cliffs, hinting at lives rooted in a past that extends beyond what the written record can fully describe. Katskhi Pillar, rising abruptly from the forested valley of Imereti, the Katskhi Pillar stands as a solitary limestone monolith whose sheer verticality defies the gentle contours of the surrounding hills, a geological sentinel shaped by ancient erosion long before human hands found a way to ascend its 40-metre height and carve a place of solitude upon its summit. From a distance, the pillar appears almost detached from the landscape, a pale tower worn smooth by rain and seasonal winds that have rounded its edges and accentuated its isolation. Yet, as one draws closer, faint traces of human presence begin to emerge in the form of narrow stairways, rope-scarred access points, and the perched silhouette of a modest hermitage, rebuilt in recent centuries atop foundations whose earliest phases remain only partially understood. Historical references to ascetic life at the pillar surface sparsely in medieval texts, hinting at a tradition of spiritual retreat that may have roots far older than its documented Christian hermitage, though the absence of continuous records leaves wide gaps that archaeologists attempt to bridge through the study of masonry fragments, tool marks on the cliff face, and remnants of earlier structures discovered during careful surveys of the summit and its caves. Geological analysis reveals that the pillar is the remnant of a once larger karst formation, slowly sculpted by dissolution runoff and the collapse of surrounding stone, making its current form a kind of natural tower whose stability is at once impressive and precarious. Fissures and bedding planes track through the limestone, offering clues about how ancient climbers may have navigated its surface long before modern equipment existed. Yet these same features complicate efforts to determine when or how the earliest ascent was achieved. At the base, a small monastic compound organises itself around the shadow of the pillar, and excavated materials, from pottery to iron fittings, suggest cycles of habitation and abandonment corresponding to shifts in regional religious life and periods of conflict. On the summit, the hermitage's stone chapel and living quarters occupy every remotely level patch of rock, their construction using locally sourced limestone blocks that mirror the pillar's own geology. Beneath them, shallow depressions hint at earlier building phases now eroded beyond clear interpretation. Contradictions appear quietly in the archaeological record. The summit's limited workable surface suggests only intermittent occupation, yet the carefully engineered cistern and drainage channels imply long-term habitation. The preserved wooden beams of the more recent structures indicate practical monastic craftsmanship, yet weathered tool marks on deeper stone recesses suggest earlier interventions whose chronology is difficult to place. Some scholars have noted parallels between Katskhi and certain ancient Caucasian traditions of high-place devotion, though such comparisons remain cautious, grounded more in geographic pattern than in direct evidence. Still, the notion that the pillar attracted ritual or symbolic significance before medieval hermits scaled it lingers as a possibility shaped by the region's broader cultural landscape. The question of how early ascetics reached the summit persists, not through speculation but through examination of the rock surface, where isolated foothold cuttings appear in positions that suggest deliberate modification, yet do not align with later access routes, leaving open whether these marks represent genuine ancient paths or natural fractures misinterpreted by hopeful eyes. In the late afternoon, when shadows lengthen across the valley and the pillar's upper chapel glows against the fading sky, the monolith takes on an almost architectural stillness, though its form remains wholly geological. The hermitage becomes a thin layer of human presence clinging to a much older foundation of stone shaped across millennia. Katskhi Pillar thus occupies a place where natural history and spiritual intention converge without fully revealing the sequence of events that bound them together, a site where evidence of devotion rests on a base whose earliest human story remains fragmentary. As evening quiets the valley and the pillar stands alone against deepening blue, the combination of enduring stone and sparse historical clues leaves an impression not of mystery invented, but of history partially obscured by time, inviting reflection on how a single vertical remnant of an ancient landscape came to hold such concentrated significance long before its story was fully written. Gelati Monastery. Set on a gentle slope above the Svetitskhoveli river, Gelati Monastery emerges not as a fortress or carved refuge, but as a deliberate architectural composition placed within a landscape chosen for clarity of light and the quiet reach of the surrounding hills, its stone facades reflecting a vision of learning and devotion that took shape under the patronage of King David IV in the early 12th century. At first glance, the complex seems firmly anchored in recorded medieval history, its main church rising with balanced proportions and arches that reveal a confident understanding of structure and harmony. Yet the wider precinct carries subtler traces of earlier occupation: scattered pottery fragments, worked stones reused in later walls, and terraces whose origins may precede the monastery itself, though erosion and reconstruction have long since blurred their chronology. As the structures come into view, the Church of the Virgin, the academical annex, the bell tower, their arrangement feels intentional, aligned with slight shifts in terrain that suggest long familiarity with the site before formal construction began, perhaps as a place of seasonal gathering or small-scale settlement. These possibilities remain tentative, grounded not in speculation but in the material hints revealed by archaeological surface surveys. Inside the main church, the murals create the immediate sense of artistic continuity within medieval Georgia, their pigments still vibrant in patches where moisture has not dimmed them. Layers of imagery revealing both stylistic evolution and careful restoration. Yet even these celebrated frescoes contain quiet ambiguities. Underdrawings, visible through worn sections, hint at earlier compositions, suggesting artistic revisions or reapplications over time, while gaps in the painted programs raise questions about whether certain panels were unfinished or lost to structural repairs now untraceable. The Academy, once a centre of theological and philosophical study, stands adjacent in partial ruin, its arches open to shifting sunlight. Its surviving walls show marks of different building phases, from finely cut ashlars to more hastily set stones, implying cycles of expansion and contraction as the intellectual life of the monastery waxed and waned. Geological studies of the region identify the local limestone and sandstone used in construction as materials quarried from nearby ridges, and the precision with which certain blocks are fitted suggests skilled masons working within established traditions, though occasional inconsistencies in tooling marks point to different workshops or periods of repair layered into the structure's long life. Water management channels surrounding the monastery, some exposed, others buried, indicate sophisticated planning, their alignment with natural contours revealing an understanding of seasonal flows. Yet the exact extent of the system remains uncertain, as later agricultural work and soil deposition have obscured parts of it. Contradictions emerge subtly in the interpretation of the site's earliest phases. While written records firmly associate Gelati with its 12th century foundation, the presence of reused masonry blocks and localized soil disturbances beneath some of its floors suggests earlier structures or activity, though no definitive pre-monastic complex has been confirmed. The monastery's role as a royal necropolis adds another layer of complexity. For while several burials are securely dated, others remain less clear due to disturbed stratigraphy and centuries of movement within the precinct, leaving open questions about how the site may have functioned in relation to earlier regional burial traditions. Even the renowned bronze door of the main church, long studied for its craftsmanship, presents minor puzzles, subtle variations in patina, and metallurgical composition imply repairs or replacements of certain elements, though the exact chronology of those interventions remains debated. As late afternoon light falls across the cloister and glances off the tiled roofs, the monastery reveals an interplay of preservation and loss, its surviving intellectual heritage hinted at by the fragments of manuscripts once copied here, now dispersed across libraries far from the site. Yet beneath this wealth of historical detail lies a quieter uncertainty, the extent to which the location itself shaped the development of the complex, and whether the monks who settled here inherited a place whose significance had older, less documented roots. When evening settles and the last birds cross the dimming courtyard, Gelati no longer appears simply as a medieval monument, but as a layered landscape, composed of deliberate architectural achievement, resting atop traces of earlier human presence that remain only partially resolved. The monastery endures as a testament to cultural ambition grounded in stone, yet with enough unanswered subtleties, foundation anomalies, reused materials, incomplete murals, to suggest that its story, though richly documented in later centuries, still contains elements that reach quietly beyond the limits of recorded history. Svetitskhoveli Cathedral. Set within the broad valley of Mtskheta, where the Mtkvari and Aragvi rivers converge in a slow, reflective sweep, Svetitskhoveli Cathedral rises from a gently elevated precinct that has drawn communities for millennia, its 11th century walls resting upon a palimpsest of earlier sacred spaces, whose outlines persist in fragments of foundation, worn stones, and archaeological layers that trace human presence back into antiquity. Approached from the old town's narrow streets, the cathedral stands with a calm, deliberate massing, its sandstone blocks catching the shifting colour of the sky. Yet the structure's measured harmony belies the complex sequence of earlier shrines, churches, and ritual landscapes that once occupied the same ground. Excavations beneath and around the present building have revealed remnants of a 4th century basilica, traces of even older Christian enclosures, and pottery fragments that point toward long-established settlement patterns preceding formal religious architecture. The cathedral's current form, completed under the master builder Arsacidse in 1029, presents balanced proportions and a subtle elongation along its east-west axis. But within its walls, structural variations hint at multiple building phases. Uneven joints between certain courses of stone, subtle differences in mortar composition, and slight shifts in the geometry of arches where repairs or reinforcements took place following damage from invasions and earthquakes. The floor itself reveals a layered chronology, Beneath worn slabs lie cavities identified as crypts, foundation trenches, and earlier flooring systems, their edges blurred by centuries of reconfiguration. Archaeological work in the precinct has uncovered stone-lined pits, fragments of tile-roofed drainage channels, and the vestiges of earlier boundary walls whose alignments do not fully match the present plan, suggesting that the sacred orientation of the site evolved over time, adjusting to new liturgical needs or responding to shifting political realities. Inside the cathedral, frescoes appear and disappear in alternating zones of preservation and loss. Surviving images glow with restrained colour, where humidity has been controlled while large sections remain bare, the plaster smoothed by later interventions or weathering caused by fluctuations in temperature and groundwater. Beneath certain layers, conservators have identified faint traces of older pigments, their outlines scarcely legible but offering quiet testimony to sequences of repainting or replacement that accompanied doctrinal and artistic changes across centuries. Such palimpsests complicate attempts to reconstruct the cathedral's earliest visual programme, for each layer only partially survives, and the gaps between them resist confident interpretation. The celebrated stone carving of Arsukidzi's right hand on the external wall, an emblem whose function remains debated, underscores the selective survival of meaning, leaving historians to weigh possible explanations ranging from a master mason's signature to a symbolic reference embedded in lost context. Geological studies of the sandstone used in construction indicate quarrying from nearby outcrops along the Mtskheta Valley, the blocks exhibiting characteristic bedding patterns that reveal the stone's sedimentary origins. Their weathering over time has created a textural variation across the facade, with earlier blocks showing deeper erosion than those replaced during later restorations. Examination of the cathedral's lower courses shows stones with tooling marks inconsistent with 11th century techniques, suggesting that builders intentionally incorporated material from earlier structures, whether out of practicality or reverence for the site's earlier sacred forms remains uncertain. The surrounding grounds present their own ambiguities. While the present wall and gate system date to later defensive phases, scattered masonry fragments to the north and east suggest the possibility of earlier enclosures whose layout is now obscured by urban development and sediment accumulation. Contradictions arise in the archaeological record, not through dramatic inconsistencies, but through small, persistent uncertainties. Foundation depths that vary unexpectedly, column bases that do not align perfectly with restored superstructures, and soil layers containing mixed materials from disparate centuries due to repeated excavation, repair, and reconstruction across the cathedral's long life. Natural processes have also contributed to this complexity. Periodic flooding from the nearby rivers may have deposited silt layers now intermingled with cultural debris, complicating attempts to draw firm chronological boundaries in the stratigraphy. Within the nave, shafts of light enter through high windows, illuminating carved capitals whose motifs blend regional traditions with broader medieval influences. Some exhibit crisp detail, while others have softened into near abstraction, the erosion hinting at phases of exposure before protective roofing or plastering was applied. The acoustics, shaped by the cathedral's domed interior, carry faint echoes even in silence, a spatial effect shaped not merely by architectural intention, but by centuries of minor adjustments that subtly altered volumes and surfaces. In certain corners, uneven floor heights suggest earlier ground levels, or the settling of underlying soil, and while structural assessments offer explanations rooted in geology and time, they also highlight how deeply intertwined the building has become with its foundation's complex history. As dusk settles over Mtskheta and the rivers darken to mirrored bands of steel and shadow, the cathedral's stonework absorbs the dimming light, its surfaces revealing shallow depressions where countless hands have touched the same points across generations. Standing in this twilight, Svetitskhoveli appears not as a single moment in architecture, but as a layered convergence of the many structures and communities that preceded it, each leaving traces that survive imperfectly yet unmistakably within its present form. The cathedral's documented medieval origins remain secure, yet the deeper foundations, fragments of older walls, hints of extended precincts and artifacts embedded beneath its floors, invite the recognition that the site's sacred significance reaches well beyond the boundaries of written history. And as the last light fades along the river confluence, the building seems to draw its long chronology inward, leaving only the quiet suggestion that even within its carefully studied stones, there remain elements of a past still waiting to be fully understood. Bagrati Cathedral. Set on the crest of Uplistsikhe Hill overlooking Kutaisi, Bagrati Cathedral presents itself as a broad, dignified silhouette against the shifting sky, its pale limestone walls rising from a platform that has drawn human settlement since antiquity, a vantage point chosen not only for its strategic height, but for the long, gentle slopes that connect it to older layers of habitation spread across the Rioni River basin. Approached from the ascending path, the cathedral's familiar 11th century form seems to offer clarity. Its cross-domed plan, sculpted arches, and balanced proportions well documented in medieval chronicles. Yet the ground beneath it carries subtler traces of earlier construction, visible in foundation irregularities and clusters of stone fragments embedded in soil that has been disturbed by centuries of rebuilding, conflict, and natural decay. Archaeological studies of the hill reveal occupation layers extending back to prehistoric times, though these deeper phases survive only as scattered ceramics, occasional hearth remnants, and faint structural outlines whose relationship to later architecture cannot be firmly established. Still, their presence forms a quiet substratum beneath the cathedral's foundations, hinting at a landscape shaped long before King Bagrat III initiated the monumental project that defined the site's medieval identity. The surviving structural elements show variations in stone size and tooling that speak to different hands at work during the initial construction, and later damage from invasions in the 17th century and periods of neglect has left the building marked by partial collapses, especially in its dome and upper walls. Modern restoration efforts, undertaken across the past century, have introduced new materials whose clean lines and precise joints contrast with the weathered limestone of the original fabric, creating a layered architectural record in which medieval and contemporary interventions meet visibly rather than blending into a single illusion of continuity. Inside the cathedral, the floor level reveals subtle discrepancies between sections rebuilt from archaeological evidence and those preserved from earlier phases. Some blocks show deep wear consistent with long use, while others remain sharply cut. Their placement guided by structural necessity rather than direct continuity with the lost medieval surfaces. Excavations beneath the nave uncovered foundation trenches, whose irregularities suggest adjustments made during initial construction to accommodate earlier stonework or uneven bedrock, though the lack of complete stratigraphic clarity prevents definitive conclusions about what stood here before the 11th century cathedral. Geological analysis of the limestone blocks identifies multiple quarry sources within the region, some with fine-grained textures, and others displaying coarser sedimentary layering, indicating that material was gathered across different phases or logistical networks. This diversity may reflect changing availability or the prolonged timeline of construction and repair. The cathedral's sculptural details, capitals, reliefs, and decorative bands vary in execution, with certain motifs rendered in crisp, confident lines, while others appear more tentative or weathered, suggesting either the involvement of multiple workshops or later reworking during restorative periods that altered the clarity of the original carvings. In the surrounding grounds, fragments of column bases, broken architectural members, and displaced stone slabs lie partially embedded in grass, remnants of earlier layouts, whose positions shifted over time through collapse, excavation, or reorganization during modern conservation. These dispersed elements complicate efforts to reconstruct the cathedral's earliest internal configuration, as some stones belong to upper sections of the structure that collapsed centuries ago, while others may originate from adjacent buildings now largely lost to time. There are quiet contradictions in the archaeological narrative. Soil layers containing a mix of medieval and early modern materials due to repeated disturbances. Foundation stones whose placement suggests reuse from unknown earlier structures. And pockets of undisturbed stratigraphy that remain too limited to form a complete picture of pre-cathedral activity on the hill. The terrain itself contributes to these uncertainties, as erosion along the plateau's edges has carried away both natural sediment and cultural debris, leaving behind a selective record shaped as much by geology as by human hands. In certain areas, ground-penetrating surveys indicate anomalies beneath the present courtyard, possible traces of earlier walls or terraces, though their outlines are too faint to support decisive interpretation, and scholars remain cautious in distinguishing between collapsed medieval features and older unrelated remnants. Within the cathedral's restored interior, light filtering through high windows reveals the interplay between original stone surfaces and modern reinforcements, the shadows falling differently across each, creating a subtle visual dialogue between past and present. The acoustic qualities of the space, once influenced by the height of the original dome, have changed with restoration, but faint echoes still linger in corners where surviving medieval masonry absorbs sound differently than newer additions. As evening draws across Kutaisi and the cathedral's facade shifts from pale gold to muted grey, the structure stands as both monument and fragment, its present form shaped by a continuous sequence of building, damage, excavation, and reconstruction. The documented medieval history of Bagrati assures its place within Georgia's architectural lineage, yet beneath that certainty lies the quieter presence of deeper, less defined occupation, glimpsed only in scattered artifacts, irregular foundations, and faint traces of earlier human activity woven into the hill itself. The cathedral thus occupies a threshold between what is known and what remains only partially resolved, its commanding position overlooking the valley, reinforcing the sense that its story, though well charted in later centuries, is anchored in a landscape whose earliest chapters persist in understated clues. And as twilight settles over the city below, the structure seems to gather its layered history into silence, leaving open the possibility that further traces, buried, eroded, or overlooked, may one day offer a clearer view of the long habitation that shaped Uplistsikhe Hill, long before the cathedral first rose upon it. Armazi Fortress Ruins. Positioned high above the meeting point of the Armazi and Mtskheta rivers, the Armazi Fortress Ruins occupy a steep, commanding ridge where natural defences and human ambition converged across centuries, leaving behind a layered scatter of walls, terraces, gate foundations, and buried cultural horizons that trace the evolution of the site from an ancient political centre to a strategic outpost shaped by successive kingdoms. Approached along the winding ascent from Mtsketa's outskirts, the first surviving structures appear almost incidental, low stone alignment softened by grass and seasonal runoff. Yet, as the ridge narrows, heavier fortification walls emerge, their basalt blocks fitted with a confidence that reflects both the engineering knowledge of early Iberian rulers and the pragmatic adaptation to a landscape defined by cliffs and shifting soil. Archaeological work has revealed that Armazi served as a significant administrative and ceremonial locus during the first centuries BCE and CE, associated with the early monarchs of Kartli. But the evidence surrounding its earliest occupation remains fragmentary. Pottery sherds of varying origins, remnants of hearths, and foundation trenches whose stratigraphy is often disturbed by later construction, seismic activity, and medieval reuse. The so-called Armazian script, preserved in inscriptions found nearby, hints at a sophisticated cultural milieu that extended beyond the fortress walls. Yet the physical record on the ridge itself is marked as much by absence as by survival, with collapsed structures and eroded terraces indicating that entire sectors may have once extended further along the spur. Geological surveys of the ridge show alternating layers of compacted soil and fractured rock, patterns that explain both the fortress's defensibility and the structural challenges faced by its builders. Certain wall segments rest on bedrock with remarkable stability, while others reveal subtle settling that caused ancient masons to adjust their alignments, creating slight angles now visible only in the surviving courses. Architectural fragments, column bases, shaped stones, and the remains of what may have been multi-story towers lie in scattered clusters, their positions altered by landslides or later repurposing, complicating attempts to reconstruct the original layout. Close study of the masonry suggests at least three major building phases: an early period characterized by large, roughly hewn blocks, a classical or early medieval phase using more regular ashlar, and later, repairs marked by smaller stones and mortar mixes containing materials from the surrounding slopes. Yet even within this sequence, contradictions persist. Certain lower walls appear older than pottery found immediately beside them, while some upper structures contain reused stones, whose original placement remains unknown. The citadel's interior terraces bear traces of domestic and administrative life, a mix of storage pits, compacted earthen floors, and what may have been small workshops, though their functions are inferred rather than firmly established due to the limited survival of diagnostic artifacts. On the southern edge of the ridge, a partially collapsed gate complex reveals strategic planning through its narrow entry passage and staggered walls, designed to control movement. Yet the absence of surviving superstructure leaves uncertain how prominently the gate once marked the fortress's threshold. The broader Armazi Valley, dotted with burial sites, shrines and ancillary settlements, underscores the fortress's role within a larger cultural landscape. But the relationship between the ridgetop stronghold and these surrounding features remains incompletely understood, shaped by uneven preservation and centuries of looting, agriculture and natural erosion. In certain areas, the soil contains mixed deposits, Roman-era ceramics beside medieval metal scraps, reflecting cycles of destruction and rebuilding that blur the boundaries between occupational phases. Even the scale of the fortress is a matter of ongoing interpretation, as modern vegetation masks collapsed perimeters, and remote sensing has identified anomalies, suggesting additional structures now buried beneath layers of colluvium. As evening approaches and the valley below shifts into muted tones of grey and gold, the ridge acquires a quiet stillness, its broken walls casting long shadows that accentuate their irregular heights. In this fading light, the Armazi ruins appear less like the remnants of a single fortified complex, and more like the exposed edges of a much broader historical tapestry, one shaped by political power, shifting regional influences, and the practical constraints of mountain terrain. The known chronology, anchored by early Iberian sources and later historical accounts, is firm enough to place Armazi within Georgia's ancient state formation, yet the deeper origins, suggested by scattered pre-classical artifacts, reused building stones and ambiguous foundation patterns, remain partially concealed within the ridge's fractured geology. As darkness begins to gather along the river confluence, the fortress seems to withdraw into its elevated perch, offering only glimpses of a past that unfolded across layers now only partly visible, leaving open the quiet possibility that further excavation or natural exposure might one day clarify the earliest chapters of its long and strategically placed existence. Shio-Mgvime Monastery. Tucked deep within the limestone gorge, west of Mtskheta, Shio-Mgvime Monastery reveals itself gradually along a narrowing valley, where the river's subdued murmur and the enclosing cliffs create an atmosphere of seclusion that seems to have shaped human activity here long before the arrival of the 6th century ascetic Shio, whose presence anchors the site's documented beginnings. Approached along a winding path that follows the base of sheer rock walls, the first structures appear modest: subterranean chambers, cave-hewn passages, and the remains of early cells carved directly into the cliff. Yet these openings hint at an older lineage of habitation, defined by quiet adaptation to the gorge's natural shelter. Archaeological investigations have uncovered pottery fragments of plaster floors, and shallow hearth traces in the upper terraces that suggest occupation predating the formal monastic community, though erosion and continuous rebuilding make the earliest phases difficult to isolate. The monastery's most prominent structure, the domed Church of St. John the Baptist, rises from a sheltered platform where rows of masonry shift subtly in colour and texture, signalling multiple construction phases that trace the site's growth from a compact hermitage into an influential medieval monastic complex. Beneath the church and across the adjacent slopes, natural caves adapted into chapels and burial spaces contain soot-darkened ceilings and wall cuts that reveal prolonged use, though determining whether these earliest occupants were organised ascetics or solitary dwellers remains uncertain. Geological studies of the gorge show layers of limestone that fracture predictably along bedding planes, creating natural cavities that early inhabitants enlarged with simple tools. The combination of natural shelter and workable stone likely contributed to the site's enduring attraction, even as centuries of rockfall and seasonal runoff have altered passageways and obscured traces of earlier configurations. Some caves contain remnants of fresco fragments, thin slivers of pigment embedded in moisture-worn plaster, indicating that certain spaces once held more elaborate devotional programs, now largely irrecoverable, while others retain only the faint outlines of niches, benches, or carved recesses whose functions remain speculative. Contradictions appear subtly in the archaeological record. Certain upper chambers display architectural shaping consistent with early medieval techniques, yet pottery recovered nearby suggests later activity. Foundational walls beneath monastic buildings reveal alignments that do not correspond neatly with the present plan, implying that earlier structures were incorporated, modified, or abandoned as the monastery expanded. The famous Cave of Shio, with its narrow entrance and descending corridor, contains layers of plaster and stonework that reflect repeated phases of visitation, enhancement, and restoration, yet the stratigraphy is fragmented by centuries of devotional use and natural sediment accumulation, making it difficult to reconstruct its earliest physical form. Above the main complex, terraced paths lead to auxiliary buildings, refectories, small chapels, and living quarters, where variations in masonry reveal episodic construction responding to changes in monastic population, regional stability, and available resources. Some walls incorporate stones clearly reused from earlier phases, their tooling marks mismatched with surrounding blocks. The monastery's water management system, drawn from springs higher in the gorge, includes channels carved into rock and clay-lined conduits whose exact chronology remains uncertain due to periodic rebuilding. Certain segments follow natural contours with remarkable precision, while others show evidence of collapse and improvisation, hinting at an evolving relationship between monastic needs and the harsh hydrology of the gorge. Written histories describe Shio-Mgvime as a significant spiritual and cultural centre during the medieval period. Yet material evidence shows interruptions in occupation, with fire-scorched layers and collapsed structures indicating episodes of conflict or retreat. At the same time, some cells contain almost undisturbed sediment layers, suggesting phases of prolonged quiet, while others display signs of rapid turnover, such as mixed ceramics and inconsistent floor levels. Even within the main church, differences in mortar composition and stone coloration across load-bearing arches suggest repairs following seismic events, though the exact sequence of these reinforcements is difficult to match to the limited records. As the afternoon light narrows into the gorge, illuminating certain facades while leaving adjacent chambers in deep shadow, the monastery's layered history becomes more apparent. A combination of natural caverns, human shaping, structural adaptation, and devotional continuity that has persisted despite repeated transformation. The buildings appear almost absorbed into the cliffs, their forms softened by centuries of weathering, and the paths between them feel shaped as much by erosion as by deliberate planning. Shio-Mgvime endures as a place where the documented monastic tradition overlays a terrain whose earlier human use remains partially visible yet unresolved, a quiet record of habitation shaped by both geological constraint and spiritual intent. And as the last light fades across the gorge and the river's sound deepens, the site seems to draw its long chronology inward, leaving only the muted suggestion that beneath its familiar religious history lie earlier chapters traced in faint carvings, reused stones, and hollowed spaces that continue to hint at lives lived here long before the written record begins. Nekresi Archaeological Complex. High on a wooded ridge overlooking the Alazani Valley, the Nekresi Archaeological Complex unfolds as a constellation of structures that reveal their history in layered, uneven intervals, beginning with the quiet silhouette of its hilltop basilica, and extending outward to terraces where faint stone alignments and scattered artifacts hint at much older patterns of habitation embedded in the slope. Approached from the winding ascent that climbs through forests of hornbeam and oak, the complex initially seems firmly grounded in early Christian history, its preserved 4th to 6th century churches, monastic buildings, and defensive towers forming a recognisable ensemble. Yet as the ground levels shift and the path narrows toward the summit, the terrain presents subtler traces of pre-Christian activity. Pottery fragments worn smooth by centuries of erosion, remnants of fired clay floors, and shallow depressions that may once have anchored structures whose forms are now nearly lost to time. Archaeological work in the area has revealed that the hill served as a focal point in antiquity, perhaps connected to regional settlement networks that stretched across the fertile valley below, though the evidence is diffuse, scattered by seasonal runoff and forest growth that obscure the contours of earlier occupation. Within the preserved monastic precinct, the basilica's masonry shows differing construction phases. Large, roughly dressed stones at the base, giving way to more precise ashlar blocks above, suggesting that builders worked with materials available from earlier structures or local quarries, adapting older foundations rather than imposing an entirely new plan upon untouched terrain. Nearby, the small domed church displays mortar textures and stone coloration that differ from its neighbours, marking it as part of a later phase of growth when the monastic community expanded and adapted to evolving liturgical needs. Yet beneath its floor, excavations uncovered mixed layers of charcoal, ceramics and soil deposits whose chronology does not align neatly with either the earliest or latest building periods, indicating that the area served multiple and perhaps shifting functions over time. The tower, rising slightly apart from the main cluster, bears tool marks inconsistent with the basilica's, its stones showing patterns of reuse that raise questions about whether its earliest form predates the monastic establishment, or was rebuilt from remnants of an earlier watchpoint on the ridge. Geological studies of the hillside reveal alternating bands of compacted clay and fractured limestone, a combination that provided both opportunities and constraints for ancient builders. Certain terraces hold firm due to underlying stone, while others have slipped subtly over centuries, tilting walls and causing irregularities in alignment now visible in the surviving structures. Some of the most intriguing features lie beyond the main buildings, where partially buried walls and terraces emerge from the forest undergrowth. Their placement suggests an organised layout, yet their construction techniques vary widely, from rough fieldstone to more deliberate masonry, complicating efforts to assign them to a single cultural horizon. Ceramic fragments recovered from these outlying areas span several centuries, their stylistic differences indicating repeated use of the ridge for habitation, agriculture, or ritual activity, though the specific nature of that use remains uncertain due to the fragmentary nature of the finds. Within the main basilica, plaster remnants on the interior walls show layers of repainting, some scarcely visible beneath later coatings. In certain sections, conservators have identified underdrawings unrelated to surviving fresco fragments, pointing to artistic programs that were altered, abandoned, or lost as the monastic community responded to shifting theological or political circumstances. Stone-lined channels near the complex suggest water management efforts, though their partial collapse and uneven preservation make it unclear whether they belonged to the monastic period or earlier occupations that relied on seasonal springs higher on the slope. Contradictions appear quietly throughout the site. Foundation stones that do not match the alignment of the structures above them. Soil layers containing mixed materials from different centuries due to repeated building, abandonment, and vegetation growth. And walls whose construction methods reflect transitions between distinct architectural traditions, blurring the distinction between continuity and reuse. In some caves near the ridge, faint traces of soot and carved recesses hint at hermitic dwellings or small-scale shelters predating the formal monastery, though the absence of diagnostic artifacts prevents confident categorization. The broader hillside, shaped by centuries of terracing and natural erosion, complicates attempts to form a singular narrative, for the boundaries between monastic, domestic, and possibly ritual spaces remain fluid in the archaeological record. As the sun lowers over the Alazani Valley, and the vineyards below fade into deepening blues, the Nekresi complex takes on a quieter presence, its clustered churches and scattered ruins appearing both integrated and incomplete. A collection of structures anchored in documented early Christian history, yet framed by earlier less defined human activity that still lingers in the soil and stone. In this evening stillness, the ridge seems to hold its chronology loosely, offering glimpses of long habitation without revealing the full extent of its earliest chapters, leaving open the possibility that beneath the familiar outlines of its basilicas and towers lie older stories shaped by communities whose traces remain faint but persistent across the slopes above the valley.